Thank you, Susan, and thank you so much for the invite here to present on suckers, something very different than what we've been hearing about so far today. But I am here to convince you we should be talking about suckers a lot more. They are our most abundant group of migratory fishes in our Great Lakes. And that's when we're looking at the entire Catastomidae family. That includes the suckers, the red horses, bigmouth buffalo, etc. And I like to refer to the suckers as the wildebeests of the Great Lakes because when we think about mighty migrations and we can envision large numbers of animals moving, wildebeests really conjure up an amazing picture in your head. Well, the same thing is happening underwater in our Great Lakes in the springtime. In all 5 of our Great Lakes, we have suckers, and they're making mass migrations to tributaries of all sizes, intermittent creeks, regular sized creeks, larger rivers. And in fact, a couple of biologists worked on the Cypress River, a tributary of Lake Superior, and captured all of the white sucker and long-nosed sucker moving into a tributary and counted over 87,000 individuals. So that's a lot of suckers. And you imagine that happening all across the Great Lakes. And when these fish are in the creeks and rivers to spawn, of course, the spawning's important for carrying on the populations of these fish, but they're also delivering really important nutrient subsidies, our nitrogen and phosphorus. And a cool bunch of studies have taken place just more recently looking at the benefits of these nutrient subsidies. And what we're finding, the suckers are moving in the springtime after these tributaries are waking up from a long winter's nap. So these nutrients are coming in and kickstarting the food web. Where scientists had blocked off sections where the suckers were present and were not present, they found that algae grew 50% faster. Aquatic insect larvae like caddisflies were growing 12% larger. And if you are a fish and you're looking to eat food, if you can eat a 12% larger caddisfly, that's like upgrading from a hamburger to a double hamburger, more calories per bite, and that's great. And of course, the suckers are also an important prey species for a lot of the fishes. There's a lot of trout that are, essentially getting the biggest bulk of their caloric intake, gouging themselves on sucker eggs in the spring. And there's a whole lot of mouths waiting for the sucker fry to outmigrate from the tributaries. All these things are happening. And of course, too, if you are by a tributary that has a large run of suckers, you might see eagles and ospreys honing in and taking those fish, bringing them back to their nest. There's also really cool trail camera footage of wolves harvesting suckers during their spawning run. So lots of value that these fish are providing. And of course, after the suckers spawn, they continue making their movements back out into the lakes. They don't die after spawning. And so they can continue to add all of these values year after year. And of course, we really don't know that much about them. There's some basic literature on suckers. We can go into our Fishes of Wisconsin or any of the other fish Bibles and look and find basic life history data. But that's really not doing a whole lot because there's so much more to learn about these fish, and the data that's present in some of that older literature maybe could be challenged with more data. So in particular, in the last 10 years, I've been focused on studying white suckers and long-nosed suckers, the most abundant of the sucker species in our Great Lakes. And if we don't have data on these fish, yes, they seem to be common species, but we could be having their populations declining and we're not even paying attention to it. Also, if we're not studying these fish and sharing the information out, we're not collecting the rest of the public with how cool these animals are. And without that data, we can't tell their stories. And that can lead to what we see here. Some of the tributaries that I study in Door County, Wisconsin, have a real wanton waste issue. And this isn't just happening in one tributary, this can happen across the Great Lakes in a number of tributaries. And this is really sad. So this is something that we want to be able to curb happening, but having stories to, again, connect with people, learn more about their life history, and share why these fish are just as cool as walleye, lake whitefish, lake sturgeon is really important. So back in 2017, I started kicking off a citizen science study. This is something I'll acknowledge that Evan Childress, who was a PhD student of Pete McIntyre's at UW-Madison, he had done a proof of concept of it back in 2011, 2012, but I really scaled this up. And so working in tributaries around Lake Michigan and Illinois, from the Highland Park area through South Milwaukee, Manitowoc, Two Rivers, up through Door County in Wisconsin, as well as more recently expanding to the eastern side of Lake Michigan around Grand Rapids, as well as working in Traverse City on the Boardman-Ottaway River. I've enlisted a whole bunch of volunteers to help me document when these suckers show up to spawn. So this is taking a page out of the bird book, where the Christmas bird count really relies on volunteers all over the place documenting the phonology of birds. So this is pretty cool to apply it to fish, and is the only freshwater fish study that I know to date that basically engages volunteers to put on polarized sunglasses and peek in the creek and look to see, are the suckers here yet? And what I do well in advance of when we expect to see the fish showing up to spawn is I'll go in and install a temperature and depth logger that takes readings every 15 minutes. I also put in a staff gauge so our volunteers can take a 1 time a day reading of the water depth. And depth is a good proxy for flow. And essentially, all simultaneously at all those sites across a latitudinal gradient, I have volunteers looking and documenting when the fish show up to spawn and how long the spawning duration lasts. And it's great because traditionally, scientists can only study a few different sites. So by, I say there's only one me and lots of not me, having this large volunteer network really allows me to collect a lot of data. And utilizing the first 7 years of data, we were able to document what is the migration trigger that suckers are cueing in on. Is it a water temperature cue? Is it a change in depth as a proxy for flow? And we found a very, very strong relationship of when the fish moved into the tributaries was associated with cumulative degree days at 43.3 Fahrenheit or 6.3 Celsius. And again, this challenges some of the literature that's out there. Some studies saying 10 degrees Celsius is the main cue, which maybe that was back when that study was published. Maybe that was the temperature cue, and we're already starting to see decades later that these fish might be responding to changes in climate, moving into tributaries earlier. But it could also be the fact that I had a very large sample size of a number of tributaries where we were doing this study. And beyond the data that allows us to look at what migration cue the suckers are honing in on is the fact that I've got a bunch of volunteers, again, peeking into creeks all over Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And the opportunity for these volunteers to share about suckers and their knowledge about why these native non-game fish is so important is just immense. So if you're out walking your dog and you see somebody staring into a river, if you're a curious person, you might be like, hey, what are you looking at? And then the volunteer will be like, oh, I'm looking at suckers. And this whole conversation of like, suckers, why suckers? And they can share all the things I told you, why they're so important for the ecosystem, etc. And that peer-to-peer sharing is just so much more valuable than hearing from a scientist. And also the opportunity to get the word out through having volunteers is immense, because all the local newspapers love to share what community members are doing. So we've been very fortunate to get a lot of media coverage. We had a great Great Lakes Now episode a few years back that really highlighted hearing from the volunteers. What were they getting out of this? What were they finding? And it's just a beautiful thing. Plus, I also learn a lot on the science communication side. What are the words they're using? What species do they relate suckers to in terms of importance for their local areas? It might be something different in Highland Park, Illinois versus up in Sturgeon Bay. We even made the front page of the Chicago Tribune, which I thought was pretty cool. I'm now going to switch over to what I've been learning with some telemetry, tagging and tracking of the suckers. So I've got two different components, the pit telemetry, the little microchips that we can put in our dogs and cats. They're relatively inexpensive, so we can tag lots of fish. But then also more recently expanding to acoustic telemetry. So the pit telemetry, looking at, does the same fish come back to the same spawning location year after year? And then acoustic telemetry to expand to the broader spatial ecology. Where are these fish going outside of spawning season? So back in 2017 and 2018, I tagged a total of 300 white suckers in one tributary of, oh, what did I do? Oh dear. Aha. In one, I'm not sure which one the pointer is. This one? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so tagged in Samuelson Creek, a tributary of Sturgeon Bay, and we started to see really high spawning return rates. So over the last 9 years, the maximum spawning site fidelity return rates at 68%, down to 32% last year. But what we're seeing as well is, of course, these fish don't have to spawn every year. They could skip spawn. And so some of that might be happening as well as some straying, which I'll get to. The pit telemetry data also is great because I've got a volunteer at that location doing the citizen science. So I can also relate what the pit telemetry says of when these tagged fish are coming in versus their first observations, and they mesh really well. The pit telemetry also shows that some males will scope the tributary before they're hanging out in there full time. So after 10 p.m., some males will go in, check, are the ladies here yet? No, by 2 in the morning, they're leaving the creek and heading back out into the mouth. And that happens for a few days until we're probably hitting our water temperature cue when these fish are moving into spawn. And what's really cool as well with the pit tag data is through other folks having pit antennas out, like in the Peshtigo River, for looking at returning lake sturgeon, we've more recently learned that a fish that I tagged in Samuelson Creek, I hadn't seen it since the year I had tagged it. It's been hanging out and spawning in the Peshtigo River for a few years, which is really curious to have tagged it in a really small tributary that's at max 2.5 feet deep into a large system like the Peshtigo, or maybe it decided to leave, the big waters of the Peshtigo, and the 1 year that I had tagged it, it was straying into Samuelson Creek. But we've also seen fish from Samuelson Creek straying into adjacent tributaries across Sturgeon Bay. So all of this really cool data with very simple pit telemetry. I was so excited, certainly with the proof of concept of seeing that we would have returning fish year after year, and the being able to piggyback off the acoustic receiver grid that was put in place for, of course, the lake whitefish, walleye, lake sturgeon studies. I could tag suckers, and as long as my fish were swimming around and being able to be picked up in the grids in Green Bay or out in Lake Michigan, I get some good information. And I really want to highlight all the different institutions that have really supported the sucker work. It has really become a community program with a lot of folks pitching in-kind donations of tags, as well as the staff from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Green Bay office as my field assistants every year to help me with the tagging. It couldn't be done without all of these folks contributing. So in 2022, I was able to tag 60 white suckers in that Samuelson Creek, and then with an even split of males and females. And then in 2024, tagged an additional 29 fish in Fish Creek, a tributary directly of Green Bay. And then last year, I was super excited to be able to tag 30 longnose suckers because, as Ben mentioned, in 2024, the acoustic array was expanded to that eastern side of the Door Peninsula. So all of these fish have tags with a 3-year battery life. Well, I'm going to go back real quick just to highlight every fish that we put an acoustic transmitter in also was equipped with a pit tag, and I put the loop tag as well on the dorsal fin. And you can see this fish here, this white sucker with the dorsal tag, also this longnose sucker, and the school of other fish with its external loop tag. So I'll cover briefly some of the highlights of what we found from the first few years of data for the white suckers. Very high spawning site fidelity, even higher than what I had seen with the pit tags. The highest return rate of 73% in the first year, down to 58% in the third year. What was so cool about working in a small tributary is that I was able to watch the behavior of the fish. For the Samuelson Creek fish, we tagged one day, left it for a day, went back and tagged the following day. And I was able to see the fish were resuming spawning the next day after tagging. So that's something that we don't usually get an opportunity to see, that right away they're returning back to that behavior. That was super cool. I also had a real-time receiver, thanks to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, that allowed me to be able to communicate with the public too what I was seeing. This real-time receiver was outside of the mouth of Samuelson Creek. And so as these fish were basically stacking up, this is in 2025, all of these are fish waiting to go into the tributary. It was so handy for me to just be showing random strangers in grocery stores. Look at, the suckers are ready to spawn. They're like stacking up. So great communication tool. Also was super handy for me to be in Chicago and be able to start seeing what was going on. And as you would expect, a lot of variability in movements, but the suckers that spawn together do not stay together year round. Some moved from Samuelson Creek out into the big waters of Green Bay, went all the way up to Fish Creek. Some fish from Fish Creek came all the way back down and were picked up at around Samuelson Creek and in Sturgeon Bay. I also had a number of fish leave Sturgeon Bay, out the Sturgeon Bay Canal, and into the big waters of Lake Michigan, where there were no receivers to pick up where they were going. But what was really cool is come spring, you'd start seeing them get picked up at all the receivers as they move back into the canal and to the tributary to spawn. So really cool stuff. Stay tuned for more information on that. And then of course too, being able to do some work at Fish Creek, which is right next to Peninsula State Park. This was a cool opportunity because a lot of folks visit the park and were popping down and saying, hey, what are you doing? Oh, you're studying suckers. That's cool. Just like a protective mama, and we had just finished tagging the 29th sucker, and I had come back and was keeping an eye not only for the avian predation, a lot of eagles and ospreys there. We caught a few suckers with talon marks in their back, but I wanted to keep an eye on these fish, and I saw there were some folks in the tributary, and I was talking to Dad on the bridge, and I'm like, oh, we just had finished putting acoustic tags into these suckers. And he's like, you put acoustic tags in suckers? I know about the lake whitefish work and all that. He's like, that's a lot of money to tag suckers. Why do you care about them? So I thought that was a really interesting point that we maybe take for granted, of the use of that technology gave suckers some clout. We were investing that kind of money in studying them. Maybe they're important enough to care about. And certainly, of course, too, that expansion of the receiver array has definitely been able to help. We did pick up a white sucker that moved down by Algoma as well in some of the mini grids. As I mentioned, longnose suckers, we just started to tag them last year, so haven't had an opportunity for a lot of data since the receiver array was downloaded. But Similarly, utilizing that loop tag in the back, we were able to watch and see the long-nosed sucker resuming regular behavior right away. We did have some individuals start to make some long movements. Within a month and a half, we saw movements from that where they were tagged by Bailey's Harbor and Door County, moving all the way south of Port Washington and getting picked up on those mini grids. So that's over 100 miles in distance. So this year we'll be tagging 30 more suckers. We'll just wait and see. So my email's up there if you want any additional information. I've got some sucker stickers for later if anybody wants sucker stickers. But I don't know. I talked too much. I'm not sure if I have questions, but you can find me at a reception. Thank you.